The Quiet Panic. You guys have been absolutely flooding my comments asking for more creepy folklore stories, and I finally found one that's going to mess with your head in ways you never expected. This isn't your typical Disney fairy tale, and trust me, after hearing what I'm about to tell you, you'll never look at Sleeping Beauty the same way again. So picture this. You're walking through an abandoned castle in the middle of nowhere. The air is thick and musty, cobwebs hang from every corner, and there's this eerie silence that makes your skin crawl. You climb these crumbling stone steps, and at the very top you find a room. Inside that room is a bed, and on that bed lies the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. She's been asleep for what looks like centuries, but somehow she looks perfectly preserved, like she just laid down yesterday. Every instinct in your body is telling you to wake her up, to save her from whatever curse has kept her trapped in this endless slumber. But here's the thing that's going to keep you up at night. What if waking her is the worst mistake you could possibly make? Now, before we dive into this nightmare, let me tell you something. I spent weeks researching this story, digging through ancient folklore, old manuscripts, and accounts that most people have never heard of. What I discovered is that the real story behind Sleeping Beauty is so much darker and more twisted than anything you've been told. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why some doors should never be opened and some people should never be awakened. The story I'm about to share with you comes from a small village in Eastern Europe, a place so remote that most maps don't even show it anymore. The locals there have been passing down this tale for generations, and they all agree on one terrifying fact. If you ever encounter someone who's been sleeping for too long, you run. You don't ask questions, you don't try to help, you just run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. It all started in the winter of 1847 when a traveling merchant named Victor was making his way through the mountains during a particularly brutal snowstorm. The wind was howling so loud he could barely hear his own thoughts, and the snow was coming down so thick he couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. His horse was exhausted, and he knew if he didn't find shelter soon, they would both freeze to death. That's when he saw it. Rising out of the blizzard like something from a nightmare was this massive castle. It looked ancient, with towers that seemed to scrape the sky and walls that were covered in ice. Victor had traveled these mountains for years, and he'd never seen this castle before. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and he wasn't about to question his luck. He tied his horse to a post near what looked like the main entrance and pushed open these enormous wooden doors. The sound they made as they creaked open echoed through the empty halls like a death knell. Inside, the castle was completely dark except for the faint moonlight streaming through broken windows. The air was so cold he could see his breath. And there was this smell, like flowers that had been left to rot for decades. Victor called out, hoping to find whoever lived there, but his voice just bounced off the stone walls and came back to him as a hollow echo. He explored room after room, finding nothing but dust-covered furniture and paintings whose eyes seemed to follow him wherever he went. The whole place felt wrong, like he was walking through a tomb rather than someone's home. But it was better than freezing to death outside, so he found what looked like a sitting room with a fireplace and decided to wait out the storm. He managed to get a fire going using some old books he found lying around, and slowly the room began to warm up. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. It was like breathing, but deeper, more rhythmic, coming from somewhere above him. Against every survival instinct he had, Victor decided to investigate. He grabbed a candle from the mantelpiece and made his way up the main staircase. The breathing sound got louder with each step he climbed, and by the time he reached the top floor, it was unmistakable. Someone was definitely up there, and they were definitely asleep. He followed the sound down a long hallway, lined with portraits of people who all had the same haunting expression in their eyes. At the very end of the hall was a door that was slightly ajar, and the breathing was coming from inside. Victor pushed the door open and stepped into the room, and what he saw there changed his life forever. The room was enormous, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows. In the center was this massive four-poster bed draped in what must have once been beautiful silk curtains, though now they were faded and torn. And lying on that bed was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a painting. She had long, flowing hair that was spread across the pillow like liquid gold, and her skin was so pale it almost seemed to glow in the candlelight. She was wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in a royal court, all intricate embroidery and precious stones, though it was covered in dust. But the most striking thing about her was how peaceful she looked. Her face was completely serene, like she was having the most wonderful dream. Victor stood there for what felt like hours, just watching her breathe. There was something hypnotic about the rise and fall of her chest, something that made it impossible to look away. And that's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The woman wasn't just sleeping, she was perfectly preserved, like she hadn't aged a single day in decades, maybe even centuries. The rational part of his mind told him to leave, to get out of that castle and never look back. But there was something about her that drew him in, something that made him want to reach out and touch her face, to see if she was real. He found himself moving closer to the bed, his hand stretched out toward her. Just as his fingers were about to make contact with her skin, the woman's eyes snapped open. But they weren't normal eyes, they were completely black, like looking into an endless void. And when she looked at him, Victor felt like she was staring directly into his soul. She didn't sit up, didn't move at all except for her eyes, but when she spoke, her voice filled the entire room. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, and her voice was like silk and poison mixed together. "You shouldn't have found me." Victor tried to step back, tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. It was like he was frozen in place, trapped by her gaze. The woman slowly sat up in bed, moving with this fluid grace that didn't look quite human. As she moved, Victor could see that her dress wasn't just old, it was rotting, falling apart at the seams, and underneath he could see glimpses of something that made his stomach turn. "Do you know how long I've been waiting?" she asked, tilting her head to one side like a curious child. "Do you know what it's like to dream for so long that you forget what's real and what isn't?" Victor tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound would come out of his throat. The woman smiled, and when she did, he could see that her teeth were razor sharp, like a predator's. She stood up from the bed and began walking toward him, and with each step she took, the room seemed to get darker, colder. "I've been dreaming about this moment," she continued, her voice getting closer even though she seemed to be moving in slow motion. "Dreaming about the day someone would finally come to wake me up. But here's the thing about dreams, Victor. Sometimes they turn into nightmares." That's when Victor realized his mistake. This wasn't Sleeping Beauty waiting to be rescued. This was something far more sinister. Something that had been using that innocent facade as bait for centuries. The woman reached out and touched his face with fingers that felt like ice. And suddenly Victor could see everything. He saw the truth about the castle, about the woman, about what had really happened here. This place had once been home to a beautiful princess who had been cursed, but not by a fairy godmother or an evil witch. She had been cursed by her own vanity, her own hunger for eternal beauty and youth. She had made a deal with something ancient and dark, trading her humanity for the promise that she would never age, never die. But the curse came with a price. She would sleep for decades at a time, and during those periods of slumber, she would feed on the life force of anyone foolish enough to try and wake her. Each person who found her, each person who tried to save her, became nothing more than sustenance to keep her preserved and beautiful. Victor could see the bones scattered around the room now, hidden in the shadows where he hadn't noticed them before. Dozens of skeletons, maybe hundreds, all of people who had stumbled upon this cursed place and made the same fatal mistake he was about to make. "You see it now, don't you?" the woman whispered, her black eyes reflecting his terrified face. "You understand what I really am." The worst part wasn't the revelation about what she was. The worst part was that Victor could feel himself getting weaker with each passing second. His life was being drained away, pulled out of him through her touch, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His vision started to blur, his legs gave out from under him, and he collapsed to the floor. But just as he felt his consciousness slipping away, Victor heard something that gave him one last surge of hope. The sound of his horse outside, whinnying and stamping its feet in panic. The storm was getting worse, and the animal was terrified. That sound, that connection to the world outside this nightmare, was enough to break whatever spell had been holding him captive. With every ounce of strength he had left, Victor rolled away from the woman and scrambled toward the door. She let out a shriek that sounded like glass breaking, like the death cries of 1,000 victims, and lunged after him. But Victor had already made it to the hallway, and he ran faster than he had ever run in his life. He could hear her behind him, not running but gliding, moving through the castle like a shadow. Her voice echoed off the walls, promising him that he couldn't escape, that no one ever escaped. But Victor didn't look back. He threw himself down the stairs, through the main hall, and out into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but it was the most beautiful feeling in the world because it meant he was still alive. He untied his horse with shaking hands and rode out into the storm, not caring where he was going as long as it was away from that cursed place. When Victor finally made it to the next village 3 days later, He was half dead from exposure and exhaustion. The villagers took him in, nursed him back to health, and listened to his story with expressions of growing horror. That's when the village elder, an old woman with scars on her hands and fear in her eyes, told him the truth. The castle appeared every 50 years or so, always during the worst storms, always when someone was desperate enough to seek shelter inside. The woman had been feeding on travelers for centuries, growing stronger with each victim, becoming more beautiful and more terrible with every life she stole. But here's the part that will haunt you forever. Victor wasn't the first person to escape. Over the years, maybe a dozen people had managed to break free from her spell and flee into the night. And every single one of them had the same experience afterward. They would have dreams, vivid dreams where they could see her still lying in that bed, still waiting. But in these dreams, she wasn't alone anymore. She was surrounded by the spirits of everyone she had killed, and they were all sleeping too, trapped in her eternal nightmare. The survivors could see their own futures in those dreams, could see themselves slowly being pulled back to the castle, drawn by an invisible force they couldn't resist. Some of them lasted years before giving in to the pull, others only lasted months. But eventually they all went back. They all returned to that room, to that bed, and they all joined the collection of bones scattered in the shadows. Victor lived for 15 more years after his encounter, always moving, never staying in one place for too long, trying to outrun the dreams that haunted his sleep. But the villagers say that on the night he finally disappeared, they could hear him talking to himself, saying over and over again that she was calling to him, that it was time to come home. The last anyone saw of him, he was walking into the mountains during a snowstorm, heading in the direction where the castle was said to appear. So here's what keeps me up at night about this story. It's not just about one cursed woman in one haunted castle. It's about the idea that some people, some things are meant to stay asleep. That there are doors we're not supposed to open, mysteries we're not supposed to solve, and people we're definitely not supposed to wake up. The next time you hear a story about someone who's been sleeping for too long, someone who looks too perfect, too preserved, too peaceful, remember Victor's story. Remember that sometimes the most beautiful things are the most dangerous, and that the person who looks like they need saving might actually be the one you need saving from. Because in the real world, in the world of genuine folklore and ancient warnings, Sleeping Beauty isn't waiting for her prince to come. She's waiting for her next victim to find her. And once you do, once you see those perfect features and that peaceful expression, it might already be too late to run. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, if you ever find yourself in an abandoned castle during a storm, maybe it's better to freeze outside than to discover what's waiting for you in the room at the top of the stairs.